Welcome everybody to GoLocal Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. In a second, we're going to go to the other co-founder, but a couple quick pieces of news. One, I want to thank Zach Levesque from North Point for joining us this morning, talking about where the markets are, especially real estate. Then Tracy Minkin, travel editor at Coastal Living. Great catching up with her on today, our 10th anniversary at GoLocal. She was our original lifestyle editor. We're going to talk to Paul. At 12 noon, we'll talk to Dr. Michael Fine, former director of health for Rhode Island, on some new data numbers. 1 o'clock, Governor Raimondo's press briefing will run. And then 2:30, Kate Nagel, our news editor, she'll be Skyping in. Let's go to Paul Krasinski, co-founder of GoLocal, and just one of the most innovative guys in technology, and someone that I never stop laughing with. Paul Krasinski, how are you?
I'm doing great, Josh. Thanks so much for having me here on the 10th anniversary. Who could believe I've been growing this beard for 10 years?
So Paul and I had an idea about, it was perfectly timed right in the middle of a global great recession. This is our 10th anniversary. It's a global pandemic. It seems perfectly timed.
Well, I feel like, heretics always seem to do the most radical things in the worst moments. But what I will tell you is, in those times of crisis, I think certainly innovation is at its highest. And you and I saw the opportunity where the old school way of presenting journalism, telling stories, and actually fully being local was just not being served in the market. And who would have thought that, a back of the napkin envelope idea would turn into this with all these studios? I'm envious.
Paul, some of the early days we went out, we tried to raise some capital. That didn't go so well. I remember we were at one meeting in an office in Providence, and the three gentlemen, very affluent, were looking at it and said, yeah, I don't know about this digital. I gotta touch my newspaper. I think most people want to touch their newspaper to get their news. I think we knew about 30 seconds into that meeting that was not going well. The world has changed. Your thoughts?
Well, we should have known when we actually had the projector and I had to move the abacus to the side in order to present onto the screen. But, I think a lot has changed. I think obviously in 10 years, think about it, if we were to chronology this whole thing, that was the standard. The Providence Journal seemed to be the leader but no digital strategy, the usage of video, the ability to kind of be in the moment, I think was really where you innovated and really drove it that way. But yeah, we certainly early on had some very interesting conversations with people who said, one, either, consumer businesses are very difficult. Two, how are you going to get it up and running? How are you going to compete against a stalwart? But one thing that I knew always is you trust your teammate, and it's always the people first that make it. And you always were the one to say, never quit.
Listen, it was an amazing team, and almost everybody is still with us in one form or another. It's really remarkable. John Giorgi still doing the weather in the Giorgi Factor every single day for 10 years. The most beloved, maybe the most beloved person in media in Rhode Island's history, and still gets the Giorgi Factor right every single day. And across the board, yourself, catching up with Tracy was great, and a slew of others. We've got a number of contributors, mindsetters, and columnists who have been writing for 10 years. It's just been remarkable.
Yeah, and I think that's really a tribute, honestly, to you, Josh, which is, culture comes from a level of leadership, passion, but also compassion for, employees. And you've done a great job. I think having that kind of retention level is really unprecedented. So, kudos to you.
Talk about what you've been doing. We'll go back to some GoLocal stories, but you've been in a lot of places doing some very innovative things in technology, and then you've got a really interesting company going right now.
Yeah, so I think, similar to what we saw with GoLocal is that, the ability to connect with people was always something that I was fascinated by. Relationships, how do they make decisions? So we saw when I founded my company in 2016 that people spend $14 trillion a year in just goods and services, 70% of the GDP, and yet brands really couldn't connect with those people. So again, similar to the old newspaper, it was always about push out. And what we said is if we can create a mobile platform that allows people to share their experiences and get value for sharing those experiences, the brands win by getting insights in real time, and the consumers win where they feel finally recognized and valued. So the people platform, we're working on a really interesting solution right now for COVID-19. We're launching a pilot in the state of Massachusetts where people are seeing us as a public service where their devices can be monitored and measured in order to get ahead of and predict kind of the flow of this virus, which has been very interesting. And again, like you always said, when you surround yourself with people that are smarter than yourself, you actually are very highly intellectually stimulated. And that's been great for us.
That's an easy bar for me, so that always works well. I do think one of the secrets to GoLocal was I knew nothing de facto. I knew it from politics and from business, the outcome of what media produces, but I never worked in media, and thus I wasn't trapped by any of that's the way you do it or that's the way we've always done it. It was very liberating. We knew we had to write good stories and get them out to people, but all the little processes and bureaucracies and fiefdoms we were able to strip away. Is that the future of business?
Without question. I think one, they always say the entrepreneur is actually the one who, has boundaryless energy and never looks at the guideposts at all. So there's so many opportunities in every business to essentially say, well, this shouldn't happen, this won't happen, that won't happen. But in reality, no one ever gets to the top of the mountain that way. I think really what I'm seeing is innovations are not just the kind of refinement on the old, but it's slightly applying it differently. In most cases, it's not a completely different model entirely, but rather it's a transformation of an existing model with better ways, processes, and operation. And I think that's what was key for us. I think you and I, we didn't know what we didn't know. So we jumped in and we said, let's just try to redefine it the best way we would. But we took it from the perspective of two people who consume media and interact with our communities. And we said, all right, is the current service opportunity, are they delivering for us, yes or no? And we both said, no, I don't really feel connected to my community. And that created the opportunity.
The entire world's business model has been flipped in the last 7 weeks. We're going to see more innovation than we've ever seen. More things are going to change in the next few months than have changed in the previous decade or two. Who's going to win in business during this period of time?
Yeah, I think honestly, we are seeing different models coming out. I think clearly we're seeing more virtualized workforce. So I think the distance learning, if you looked at Microsoft, people raised an eyebrow when they looked at buying Skype and then buying LinkedIn. And people said, well, could you get that value? The answer is we're seeing that now that more is going to be virtualized. So I think those will be winners, communications firms and companies. I think the second thing is people who are willing to step forward into privacy versus running away from it. If you can actually respect consumers and put them first. So that's where we did with the people platform, was just to say, hey, we understand your information is both valuable to you and it needs to be protected, but we will work with you in order to do that. So I think those firms that move away from just the traditional advertising, hitting and bombarding consumers with messages that are irrelevant, they also will be, there. Finally, I think what we're seeing is this is not going to go away anytime soon. So the healthcare companies, where the innovation is going to happen, is really on the process and how do we go to market? How do we make sure that we are not caught flat-footed again with the red tape, the regulations, and otherwise? And then lastly, I think one thing that is really going to be innovated on and transformed is the logistics. Who could think that we couldn't get, ventilators and otherwise out? We can't get food that is normally for restaurants distributed out to these communities where it's struggling. And we had to rely on who? People that actually created food pantries in their front lawns to actually service people. So I think there will be this return to kind of a natural human connection and where people are going to kind of change slightly from this kind of focus on self and individual and more around kind of the greater good.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I mean, I think everyone has a different perspective on life. For a lot of people who are out of work or whose businesses are on the verge of collapse, it's a very, very scary time. In Rhode Island, unemployment's about 40%. You know, there's no return to normal. It's only going to be outward. It's a great time to innovate. Paul, let's talk a little bit on the founding of it. Listen, we'd go and talk to people at the beginning of GoLocal. Both of us had successful careers at the time, and they literally looked at us and said, you're going to build something that's going to compete with a nearly 200-year-old newspaper that has a newsroom of 120, 130 people. You're insane. And we may have been. Is this the same type of opportunity for people to really rethink what they're doing and to take on that passion to be able to create something completely new?
I do. I think, you know, there's two things that I think about, which is belonging and authenticity, right? Right now, I think most of corporate America is belonging to a culture, right? They go to work, they do their job, they sit in their cubicle, they go home, they go to the soccer games and otherwise. It's those people who are going to stand up, you know, not dissimilar to Jerry Maguire and say, hey, who's coming with me? We're going to rethink this model entirely. And I think that moves them into their authenticity. For me, you know, the people platform actually was that, which is I saw gaps in the market research and consumer behavior space, but I also said people just in general are not having a unified voice across the country on a number of topics. So I think if they're bold and brave and courageous, as you know, obviously you were in starting it up. The one note I would say is back in the day, do you remember we actually had the opportunity to meet with Tim Armstrong, and he was launching Patch at the time for local websites. And I think fast forward a couple of years, he reached out again to us and said, hey, do you want to buy the local Providence Patch? So it's, again, where we commit to local content and it's personalized, it's relevant, and it makes sense for people's lives. That's really where the magic happened here. And I think that is where people will take their expertise and apply it differently. But it takes the bold, courageous, and brave to kind of step forward and do it.
Listen, your comment about some of the leading folks in media that we met with in those early days, one of them was we were going to have an audience with one of the biggest people in the history of radio in America, Jimmy Castro, who had built mammoth radio conglomerates. We were on our way to see him. We had to get up early. We were going to meet him in New York. Tell a little bit about the story.
Yeah, so it was so I'm going to state the disclaimer, which is it was a very early 4:30 a.m. wake up for a 6 a.m. Amtrak. So needless to say, and not to wake the others in my household, I was doing getting dressed by candlelight. So I arrived to the Amtrak station. I hop on at Westwood feeling very good about myself and my outfit. And then we arrive in Providence. You get on and say, wow, is this a new trend? You have black pants with a navy blue jacket. And I had that moment where they always say it's oh my goodness. And sure enough, I walked into that meeting looking like a radio executive with a very couture look.
By the way, we processed whether or not there was the opportunity to get a different blazer in New York before we met with Jimmy Castro. But the one problem is you're 6'9". There's not a lot of off the racks that work well for you. I
think what we saw was it was either going to be a muumuu, a curtain, or just a flag that we could drape over. But anything else at that hour was not going to work for us. You're right.
His security group in his black Land Rover bulletproof car was also a little disarming as well at 10 o'clock when we met him in one of the hotels in New York in the
Absolutely. That was so funny. He loved the concept. He loved the concept.
He did love the concept. Paul, talk a little bit about, technology is now, I think, at its golden moment, right? People now aren't sitting across the table from each other. business is continuing by having Skypes or Zooms or Microsoft meetings. Where will all this go, and when do you think it explodes to even the next generation of technology applications?
Yeah, I think it's starting to happen now. I think the innovation, especially during a crisis like this, really starts to force people to move product roadmaps and innovation forward more quickly. I think the remote workspace is a reality. I think a lot of the large companies managing global teams actually have had this in place. The difference is they've always had a high concentration of in the headquarter home office, which was important. Now, as I've been talking to colleagues at large companies, they've been saying it's managing the junior people and mid-level managers who are used to going into the office, having that socialization. So one thing I think where it's ripe for innovation and transformation is around mental health, right? And kind of allaying that fear of stigma around, hey, I don't feel great. I'm not having the interactions. I feel isolated. And I think that's where you'll see the next set of apps coming, where you're going to have to build a culture where there is no substitute for face-to-face interaction. You're going to have to come up with other more synthetic ways. But we've seen, as you and I know, with the social media platforms, that people are already struggling in the next generation to have real conversations, where I say, hey, this is a gap, call the client. It's hard for some younger generation people to do that. And so we need to find the balance, right, which is face-to-face interaction, but also tools that make it efficient to communicate around the world.
Paul Krasinski, always insightful, smartest guy I know. Want to thank you for joining us today, and thank you for working together for 10, 11 years. Always good times, always hysterical learnings, and congratulations on all your success. For everybody else, we'll talk to you soon. We'll have Michael Fine back on at 12 noon. Stay tuned. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful.
Stay safe.
Thanks so much, Josh. Congratulations.